Hi guys. It's weird, I guess, that I did a two-parter, but it really is like two different chapters in a lot of ways. We just talked about like internal reactions to industrialization. Now we're going to talk about external reactions to industrializations, how non-industrial states reacted to Europe industrializing. Okay. So the first state we're going to talk about is the one that's adjacent or a part of Europe, and that's the Ottoman Empire, right? When he learned about the Ottoman Empire in Units 3 and 4, it was one of the most powerful countries in the world. The industrialization changes that dynamic. In fact, industrialization leads to this period where the Ottomans' power declined in a lot of ways in the Mediterranean world, in the Middle East, and in Southern Europe. And so this decline is not unnoticed by the Ottoman state. So beginning with the Sultan Mahmud II, they begin this effort of reforming the Ottoman Empire to address the growing strength of Europe, right? Because remember, Europe's kind of hostile to the Ottomans in general. So, for example, methods that had been extremely important to how the Ottoman government had run their state for the preceding, 400 years are now perceived to be obsolete. So the janissary system, mainly because of how much revenue they collected and how they challenged the succession system, were abolished. And they weren't happy about this, and the janissaries in many ways resisted, but the Ottomans ultimately were able to overcome janissary resistance and install a military that was no longer dependent on this janissary and devshirme system. Mahmud II also developed roads and the postal service, and AMSCO determined that was important to tell you guys. The larger effort of Ottoman reform is known as the Tanzimat reforms. The first element that was focused on the Tanzimat reforms was to challenge corruption. And this is going to be a theme you're going to look at when we talk about China and Japan. China and Japan as well. So corruption is essentially when someone uses their political position for personal gain, right? When you're a representative of a government, your job is not, you're not an individual, right? Like I'm not Jennings, the individual, when I am your teacher, like I am operating as a member of the government, right? So say if I were to take bribes to improve your grades, that would indirectly, it's not the most egregious example of corruption ever, but it would be kind of corrupt, right? I'm using my position of influence, right? You guys need me to give you, you guys perceive you need me to give you good grades to secure your social mobility in the future. So I use that to benefit myself. I say, if I got a $25 Amazon gift card during every quiz, everyone will get 100. That's corruption, right? Or taking bribes to like allow people to to get a certain contract with the government, right? There are two construction companies that want to build a road. The company that paid the official that made the decision who does that gets paid a bribe. That bribe doesn't go to the government, that goes to the individual. That's corruption. So the Tanzimat addressed corruption. It secularized education. Historically, the Muslim clergy had been in charge of education. Now education was secularized. The state was in charge. Ottoman laws. Remember, the Ottomans are a very fragmented state. And so when dealing with foreigners, every region varied a great deal, right? You could even kind of see examples of that in how Muhammad Ali is treated differently in the previous chapters. And perhaps what is the most transformative would be the Hati Humayun. I was just going to give that a whirl. And the Hati Humayun was a policy that guaranteed equality of all men, regardless of religion and ethnicity. And remember, the Ottoman Empire is immensely religiously diverse and also ethnically diverse. In fact, at the point of the Ottoman Empire that we're talking about, 40% of the Ottoman population is Christian, right? So we think of it as a Muslim state, but actually a good deal of it is Christian. One of the most popular policies of the Tanzimat is this, and is the Hati Humayun, and specifically the millet system that gives ethnic minorities the means to govern themselves with the standards and morals and practices that they determine are important, right? So long as they're paying their taxes to the Ottoman state, they are content with being governed by the Ottomans because they're allowed to govern themselves how they see fit. So a great example of this would be that there's a sizable Jewish population in Jerusalem, which is under Ottoman control. Those Jewish people in Jerusalem govern themselves through Jewish law and custom, like through the Torah and things like that. And so that policy is immensely popular with the Jews of the Ottoman Empire. For example, there are no Ottoman Jews that identify as Zionist, right? At some point, there are Zionists that come to Jerusalem, and that's a whole interesting element where Ottoman Jews and European Jews don't quite get along because they kind of perceive the path differently. And we'll talk about that a little bit if you take me for IB World History in your senior year. So the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman economy and society also changes a great deal. What is important is that while the Ottoman economy industrializes, it does not industrialize to the scale that other European states do. But there are still transformations. Wages become cash-based. Prices fall. There are legal reforms that actually, through secularization, re-entrench patriarchal norms at the expense of women. So, for example, Quranic law or Sharia law has very concrete stipulations to protect the rights of women, specifically in the inheritance of property. So, and Amsco talks about how women actually lose access to property inheritance through the secularization of laws and the imposition of patriarchal law codes. So that's kind of an interesting element, that actually women had more rights, Islamic women had more rights in Islamic law than they did in secular law. Then Abdul Hamid comes to power in the 1870s. He's vibing. He's ready to make the Ottoman Empire a constitutional monarchy, actually, where there's actually elected representation. People in the Ottoman Empire vote to choose the leaders of the Ottoman Empire. And then Russia beats the crap out of the Ottoman Empire in one of the many Russo-Ottoman wars that are not talked about in AMSCO at all, but are so important to Ottoman history. And so, as a reaction to the Ottoman Empire getting defeated so badly, he suspends the constitution and rules as a dictator for the next 40-ish years until 1908. And during this period, non-Turks, specifically Armenians and Assyrian Christians, are targeted by Ottoman civilians, by Turkish civilians, and several 100,000 over a period of time are killed because they are different, right? And that's just an element of the dictatorial. It's not like Hamid is like directly relevant. He's actually critical of these policies because as an Ottoman, he's not necessarily a Turk. He's an Ottoman, and Turkish national consciousness and Ottoman national consciousness to some extent overlap, but in some ways are contradictory. But Ottoman nationality actually is inclusive of a lot of different ethnicities, but gives like a paramountcy to the Turkish ethnicity because they're the majority ethnicity of the Ottoman Empire. It's messy. And if you want really to learn about the mess, take IB history for seniors. If you're IB student, you're going to get this eventually next year, 2 years ago, 2 years from now. So our next group is China. So China, like its Ottomans, like moderately modernize. The Chinese ultimately fail to modernize. So the impetus for modernization comes a lot from regional leaders and less from central leaders, because in these centers of political power, like the capital, the way you got into those positions was through success in the civil service exam or being the beneficiary of like historic trends of privilege, right? So you benefited from how things had been done, or you did well in a test over documents that were over 1,000 years old at this point, okay? Or around 1,000, well over 1,000 years old at this point. So in general, the central government of China remains extremely conservative to new innovations in governance and even new technologies. So the self-sufficiency movement, though, finds success in regions of China where they work to modernize production. They work with the British and French advisors to adopt British and French-style policies. They change their tax and customs policy. The emperor at the time, Emperor Guangxu, he's very receptive to reform, and he institutes these 100 days of reform that challenge corruption at all levels of government, and then also institute European processes at the economic and medical level. Eventually, he is overthrown in a coup d'etat by his aunt, who is also his adopted mother, who is rather conservative. And one of the reasons why she has success is that the court in the capital of China all supports her conservative policies. She doesn't like foreign ideas, so she ends the development of railroads and telegraphs throughout China. By the end of her reign, she's like, wait a second, maybe we should be taking some of the good things we like about European policies and using those instead. And so she does do that. The civil service exam kind of has become like this vestigial tool. Ultimately, how you do well in the civil service exam is by paying a bribe, which is not great. So it means the people who can afford to pay the bribes get the positions in government based on their performance in the exam, but they just paid a bribe to get that performance and that score. China, this is a kind of a continuity. China has always been hostile towards foreigners, and so that created a general barrier to European expansion. Europeans wanted to change that, and they changed it where they could. Internal strife that we'll learn about in the next few chapters will be, especially in Unit 6, also weakened China. And then the Qing dynasty is overthrown in 1911, and a Republican government is installed. Japan is the state that has the most success in terms of reforming, right? So the Meiji Restoration goes into effect. They end the system of governance that historically had existed, using samurai as bureaucrats and fighters. They don't want to use them anymore. So like the Ottomans and the Janissaries, the Chinese stop relying on the civil service exam, and the Japanese abolished the samuraiship. And so all these are changes from pre-existing modes of governance, right? So the Bushido had been the warrior's code. We learned about that in Unit 1 and 2. That no longer becomes a state ideology. Some samurai actually just go with the flow, and they become what are called genros, who work within the government to like put this new bureaucratic system, this new modern European system. While other samurai resisted. Again, I think I talked about this with my fifth period today. Last Samurai is about one of those holdout groups. It's a movie with Tom Cruise. It's not, that didn't actually happen, but the tensions that are talked about in Meiji Japan are authentic to a thing that happened. There were armed revolts of samurai against the Meiji government. Japan essentially becomes an industrial state over a 30-year period. It transforms dramatically. It becomes industrialized, and as an industrial state, in order to become more industrial, it must expand. So it begins to become an imperialist state as well, and through that imperialist process becomes less and less democratic, culminating in the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 and all that drama that you'll learn about in Unit 7. Yeah, Unit 7. So there are some problems with the reform, like the general recap of reform. Ottomans in China failed to effectively reform in a meaningful way. Japan did. All of these states identified eventually a need to change their policies to address the power discrepancy developing between them and European states. That change created a conservative backlash, and depending on a state's ability to control that conservative backlash, determined their effectiveness in resisting the expansion of European states, right? And when I say conservatism, all I'm saying are like the forces that were opposed to change and sought to conserve how these states had existed previously. So that is our second half of 5.8, and we have 2 more chapters to go, and they will be quicker, I pray. I'll see you guys in the next video.